Maryland, 1978. A year that should have been just another page in a quiet suburban town. A place where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, where parents trusted the rhythm of their days, and where danger felt like something that only happened in far-off cities. But on a warm September evening, that illusion shattered the moment 17-year-old Tanya Ellison didn't walk through her front door. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't the type to disappear for attention. She was responsible, the kind of daughter who called home even when she was running 5 minutes late. She dreamed of studying early childhood education. She worked part-time at the bakery on Main Street, and she carried her mother's hope in every step she took. But that night, everything changed. Her mother, Denise, remembers standing by the kitchen window, waiting for headlights that never reached the driveway. She remembers the fear that crept into her chest when the phone stayed silent. She remembers walking the same route Tanya always took, only to find her daughter's bracelet lying in the grass, snapped clean apart, as if someone had torn her from the life she deserved. That was the moment Marilyn stopped feeling safe. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Denise could tell something was wrong before she had proof. Some mothers just feel it, a shift in the world around them, a wrongness in the air that refuses to be ignored. She called Tanya's friends first. None of them had heard from her. She called the bakery. They said she'd left on time, smiling, carrying her school notes like always. Nothing sounded alarming, until you combined it with silence. By 10 p.m., that silence felt violent. Her father, Marcus, got in the car and started driving the same 3-mile stretch over and over, headlights cutting across quiet sidewalks as if the road might reveal something if he stared long enough. Every mailbox looked suspicious. Every parked car felt like a warning. Every shadow seemed to hold answers it refused to give. But the truth hit when he found Tanya's second shoe, not far from a torn patch of grass, lying abandoned near the old wooden fence behind the community center. A place she had no reason to be, a place she would never have gone alone. What was left of their peace ended right there. Police arrived minutes later, but to the Carters, it felt like hours. Flashlights swept the field, officers whispering to each other like they were afraid to say the wrong thing out loud. Denise stood clutching her daughter's jacket, rocking back and forth, praying, bargaining, breaking, all at once. Marcus kept walking the perimeter, calling Tanya's name into the dark until his voice cracked. Neighbors came outside, pretending they were just checking, but everyone knew the truth. Something terrible had happened, and no one wanted to admit it first. An officer tried to reassure them, saying, "She probably wandered off." Denise snapped back with a pain only a mother could understand. "She doesn't wander. She was taken." And deep down, even the officers knew she was right. The only thing more terrifying than a crime is a crime that leaves almost nothing behind, just a shoe, a patch of torn grass, and two parents begging the night to give their daughter back. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The search for Tanya stretched into the early morning, swallowing every ounce of hope her parents had left. Denise tried calling the phone again, even though she already knew there was no ring, no buzz, only the emptiness of a call that would never be answered. Marcus dropped to his knees in the cold dirt, his hands shaking as he stared at the small footprints leading toward the tree line, and stopping abruptly like someone had erased the rest of her path. One detective whispered to another, "This isn't a runaway." He wasn't wrong. Everyone felt it. Everyone feared it. The community rallied fast, flashlights, dogs, volunteers, but the air carried a heaviness that made every second feel stolen. People walked through brush and thorns, calling her name, praying she'd call back. But the woods stayed quiet, too quiet. Denise kept repeating, "She was right here. She was right here." Hope was slipping. Answers were slipping even faster. And somewhere in the darkness, someone already knew they would never find her that night. By 4 a.m., the searchlights clicked off one by one, leaving the woods swallowed in darkness again. Officers stepped back, defeated, whispering into radios that held no good news. Volunteers returned to their cars with lowered heads, afraid to say out loud what they were all thinking. When a child is missing for this long, the night stops feeling like night. It starts feeling like a warning. Denise refused to leave. She stood on the edge of the field, arms wrapped around herself, staring into nothing as if she could force the shadows to give her daughter back. Marcus paced in circles, muttering to himself, refusing water, refusing comfort, refusing to accept that his little girl, his heart, had been swallowed by darkness he couldn't fight. A discarded juice box near the ditch felt like a punch. A ripped notebook page near the curb brought officers running. Every clue hurt more than it helped. Some moments break a family. This one broke a community. And as sunrise crawled over Maryland, the truth settled into every front porch, every living room, every shaken voice. Tanya wasn't lost. She was taken. As the morning news spread across Maryland, the story of an 8-year-old girl vanishing on her way home from school struck every household like a blow. People stopped mid-conversation. Radios fell silent. Parents gripped their children tighter, suddenly aware of how fragile safety really was. It didn't matter that Tanya lived only 3 streets away from her school. It didn't matter that everyone in that neighborhood had known each other for decades. Overnight, trust cracked. Cars slowed at every intersection where officers placed fresh tape. Neighbors who once greeted each other now watched from their windows. Every unfamiliar face became a threat. Every noise in the distance felt like a question people were too scared to ask out loud. Denise sat stiffly in the living room, haunted by the idea that Tanya might be calling her name somewhere she couldn't reach. Marcus stared at the open front door for hours, waiting for footsteps that never came. Grief didn't hit all at once. It seeped in, stretching across the walls of that home like a shadow that refused to move. The world didn't end that day, but for the Johnson family, it stopped breathing. Hope collapsed fast in that neighborhood. By nightfall, volunteers filled the streets with flashlights, calling Tanya's name into the cold air. People searched yards, sheds, alleys, anywhere a frightened child might hide. But deep down, everyone felt the same dread creeping in. She wasn't hiding. She'd been taken. When detectives arrived, Denise kept trying to speak, but her voice cracked each time she repeated the same sentence. She should have been home by now. She should have been home. Marcus tried to stay upright, answering every question, replaying every moment of Tanya's short walk. But the more he spoke, the more his hands trembled. He wasn't afraid of losing her. He was afraid someone already had. Even the officers felt a shift in the air. Not danger, not chaos, but a kind of heartbreak that swallowed the room whole. Tanya's backpack lay on the sidewalk where she'd been seen last, the strap torn as if someone had ripped it out of her hands. It was the first sign that this wouldn't be a simple missing child call. It was the start of a nightmare that would stretch across generations. And tonight, yes, we reopen it. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Great. Moving into section 2 now, exactly as instructed. Word count, pacing, tone, emotional pressure, tension build up. An absence of all prohibited words will be maintained. The investigation began with a kind of confusion that should never happen when a child is missing. Detectives rushed in, radios buzzing, voices layered over each other, every officer asking the same questions as if a different tone would magically change the answers. Denise tried to stay steady as they questioned her, but every sentence cracked under the weight of panic. Marcus stood beside her, jaw clenched so hard he could barely speak. Officers canvassed the street, but the neighborhood felt strangely frozen. A few people claimed they saw Tanya walking. One neighbor said she looked hurried. Another insisted she was fine. Someone else swore they saw a car slowing down near her. But no one could agree on the color, the model, or even which direction it went. Confusion drowned the truth faster than any real lead could surface. The officers tried to reassure the family, saying, "Kids wander off." But Tanya was not the wandering type. She followed rules like they were stitched into her bones. She was careful, thoughtful, and always told her parents exactly where she was going. Yet here they were, standing in their own yard, surrounded by police lights, pretending they weren't already terrified. Hours passed, and the search widened. But the truth was undeniable. Something had gone wrong long before the officers arrived. As the hours passed, the neighborhood transformed from calm to frantic. People crowded onto their porches, whispering half-truths that spread faster than any officer could correct them. Someone claimed they saw a man standing near the corner mailbox. Another swore they saw Tanya speaking to an older woman. A teenager insisted she saw a dark vehicle, but when questioned again, she changed her mind twice. Every version of the story contradicted the last. Detectives tried to separate witnesses, but the confusion spiraled until the truth was buried under guesses, nerves, and fear-soaked imaginations. Officers scribbled notes that contradicted each other. Statements blurred into a maze of uncertainty. Nothing could be trusted. Not even the time people claimed they saw her. Parents in the neighborhood tightened their hold on their children. Doors that were usually left unlocked were bolted shut. Lights flicked on in houses where people normally slept early. The sense of safety that once wrapped the community now felt shattered. Denise stepped outside and found neighbors staring at her with pity and guilt in their eyes. She didn't want their pity. She wanted her daughter. She wanted someone, anyone, to just give a clear answer. Instead, all she received were rumors and confusion disguised as help. The investigators grew frustrated, the family grew numb, and the growing panic pulled the case further away from clarity. Detectives moved fast, grabbing onto any name that even slightly brushed the edges of the story. They started with the obvious: people who knew Tanya, people who crossed her path, people who lived close enough to notice her routine. The first was a co-worker from the diner where she worked the weekends. He admitted he walked her to the bus stop once or twice, but his alibi for that night was airtight. He'd been at a family gathering with 20 witnesses. He was cleared before noon. Next was a neighbor who often waved at her from his yard. People swore he acted strange, but strange wasn't a crime. He opened his door with shaking hands, terrified to even be considered. A quick check confirmed he was at work on the overnight shift. A passing driver was questioned after a resident claimed they might have seen Tanya near his car. But when officers found him, he showed receipts proving he'd been 2 towns away at a gas station during the time she vanished. Every suspect fell apart the moment detectives pushed even slightly. Every lead dissolved in their hands. Officers kept circling the same empty spaces, searching for something that wasn't there. To Denise, it felt like watching people grab at fog while her daughter's hours slipped away. The wider the net grew, the thinner the truth felt. Stretched, strained, almost ready to snap. Denise waited for answers that never came. At first, she tried to stand tall, telling herself the police just needed time. But as the hours dragged into days, her strength began to crack. She barely slept. She barely ate. She moved through her own home like she didn't belong there anymore, like every room had turned into a reminder of what she had lost. Tanya's bedroom stayed untouched, her backpack still by the door, her jacket still on the hook. Denise kept staring at the clock each night, whispering the same line she had said since Tanya was a child. "Come home now, baby. It's getting late." But this time the house stayed cold. Her husband tried to keep the family steady, but grief doesn't care about pride. It breaks people the same way. Slow, quiet, without warning. He searched the woods every morning before work. He searched them again after sunset. Some nights he came home with scratched arms and soaked shoes, but he never found anything. Only more silence. Detectives told them the leads were weak, the timelines unclear, the witnesses confused. Denise didn't care. She just needed someone, anyone, to look her in the eye and promise they wouldn't give up. No one did. By the 3rd week, the investigation felt less like a search and more like a countdown. Every day without news tightened the ache in their home until breathing felt impossible. The first 2 days after Lydia vanished felt like a punishment the family didn't deserve. Officers moved through the small Maryland neighborhood with clipboards and clipped voices, acting as if routine could fix what had been torn apart. They questioned neighbors who barely remembered what they were doing 5 minutes earlier, let alone the night before. Answers changed, descriptions changed, confidence changed, but nothing brought them closer to Lydia. Her mother, Joanne, kept replaying the last moment she saw her daughter, a wave from the porch, a promise to be back before dinner. It was the kind of promise every parent trusts without thinking. Now it sat in her chest like a weight she couldn't lift. She begged officers to check the woods again, to search the old rail yard again, to knock on one more door. They told her they were doing what they could, but Joanne knew when someone was giving up. She felt it in the way their voices softened, in the way their eyes drifted past her instead of meeting them, in the way they avoided saying her daughter's name out loud, as if speaking it would make the failure louder. By the end of the second night, the search lights were gone. The cars were gone. The urgency was gone. Only the fear remained. By the third day, the investigation slipped into something colder. Not by decision, but by neglect. Officers started leaning on the same unreliable accounts, hoping one would magically make sense. A teenager swore he saw Lydia walking fast near the old produce market, but he changed the time twice. An elderly man claimed she stepped into a dark-colored sedan, but he couldn't recall the make, the plates, or even whether the car was moving or parked. Another neighbor insisted she heard a scream, only to admit later she wasn't even home that night. The case felt like grabbing smoke. Every time someone thought they found direction, it scattered. Joanne tried to hold on to the hope that somebody, anybody, had seen something real. She knocked on doors herself, showing Lydia's photo until her hands shook. Some people were kind. Some pretended they cared. Others closed their doors the moment they realized she wanted answers, not sympathy. Meanwhile, the officers began treating contradictions as normal complications instead of warning signs. They filed every statement but challenged none of them. It was easier to blame confusion than to admit the investigation was slipping. Joanne noticed the shift immediately. She saw it in how quickly they moved on from one false lead to the next, how little they pressed witnesses, and how often they reminded her that memory can be tricky. But her memory wasn't tricky. Her daughter was gone, and the town had nothing solid to offer her. The first suspect emerged from nothing more than coincidence. A co-worker who left the deli the same night Lydia vanished. His name sat on every early report, circled in red ink, but after one short interview, officers decided he didn't seem nervous. That was the standard. No evidence, just impressions. He walked free. The second suspect was a neighbor who often waved at Lydia from his porch. Joanne remembered how her daughter once mentioned he stared too long, but when police finally spoke to him, the conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. He smiled. He cooperated. Case closed, at least for them. The third was a delivery driver whose route passed Lydia's street twice a week. He couldn't recall whether he saw her that night. They didn't check his logs. They didn't inspect his truck. They simply let him go. Each elimination cut deeper than the last. Joanne watched officers cross out names as if they were clearing a grocery list, not chasing the person who stole her child. She asked why none of the suspects were followed longer, why their stories weren't checked against timelines, why they kept saying, "We're doing our best," when their best looked like giving up. The silence in response was always the same, a shrug, a vague explanation, and a reminder that they had nothing solid. But Joanne felt it in her bones. They weren't out of leads. They were out of urgency. Every time detectives said they had nothing new, Joanne refused to accept it. She showed up at the station with Lydia's planner, her school essays, even a map she marked with every place her daughter walked. She begged them to search the wooded trail behind Cedar Lane again. She begged them to question the neighbor one more time. She begged them to check the drainage ditch where a jogger once reported seeing a torn shoe months earlier. They kept telling her it didn't fit the timeline. What timeline? Her daughter had vanished. Time had become meaningless. Joanne tried everything: community meetings, missing person flyers, radio announcements, even writing letters to the mayor. Each attempt was met with polite sympathy that never turned into action. Officers rotated shifts, supervisors changed desks, And every new face meant Joanne had to retell the same story from the beginning, reliving the night her world broke. She watched the men taking notes only halfway listen, their pens slowing each time she cried. To them, she was the grieving parent who can't let go. To her, they were the people standing between her and the truth. On the 6-month mark, when she asked whether they could reopen the earliest tips, the truck sighting, the man near the woods, the neighbor who stared too long, the sergeant sighed and told her, "We have to move on to cases we can actually solve." It felt like the entire town had decided Lydia's life was no longer urgent. Joanne knew better. She felt the weight of danger still close enough to breathe. By winter, the investigation had thinned out to a handful of half-hearted check-ins and unanswered messages. Tips that once felt urgent were now old leads. Witnesses who once spoke with confidence suddenly claimed they weren't sure anymore. Even the man who reported seeing a girl matching Lydia's description near the highway withdrew his statement, saying he didn't want trouble. Files were misplaced. Statements were logged out of order. One officer forgot to record a call from a woman who claimed she heard a scream the night Lydia vanished. When Joanne asked about it, the department shrugged it off as not reliable. The worst blow came when a new detective reviewed the case and declared there was no sign of foul play. No sign, a ripped jacket, a dropped notebook, and a vanished teenager weren't enough. Joanne's hands shook when she heard it. She realized then that solving the case meant more to her than to anyone wearing a badge. Eventually, the officers stopped returning her calls quickly. Responses turned into days, then weeks. Finally, someone at the front desk gently suggested she focus on healing. Healing, as if she could heal without answers, as if her daughter had simply drifted away instead of being taken. The file was marked cold the following spring, a single stamp on a page, cold, and the town exhaled like the nightmare was over. But Joanne didn't exhale. She felt something dangerous settle into the silence, the kind that grows when nobody's watching anymore. After the cold case stamp went onto Lydia's file, something inside the community shifted, and not in a way anyone would admit out loud. People didn't gather to talk about her anymore. They avoided Joanne at the grocery store, not out of cruelty, but out of fear that looking into her eyes might force them to remember a truth they weren't brave enough to face. Lydia's closest friends stopped knocking on the door. At first, they brought cookies, handwritten notes, little drawings she'd once made for them. But as weeks turned into months, the visits grew awkward, then infrequent, then non-existent. Teenagers moved on with their lives. Adults whispered, "It's a tragedy," and then pivoted to safer topics. New shops, school events, weather, anything but the girl who vanished in the dark. Joanne saw it happening in real time. The world wasn't cruel. It was forgetful, and sometimes that hurt even worse. Her phone used to ring nonstop. Now it rang once a week, then once a month. Officers called less, reporters stopped calling entirely, and neighbors only checked in when they needed to ease their own guilt. The silence became heavy, familiar, almost routine. But Joanne refused to let routine swallow her daughter's name. She printed new flyers every season. She left them in cafes, libraries, and bus stops, even when employees tore them down by the end of the day. She kept her porch light burning every night, a promise she made to herself on the first night Lydia didn't come home. Everyone else had moved on. She hadn't. She couldn't. By the end of that first month, the town's energy collapsed. What started as a hopeful search began to feel like a long, painful march toward nothing. The volunteers who once covered every inch of the woods started thinning out, first quietly, then completely. One morning, Miriam stepped outside expecting to see the usual group of neighbors gathering with flashlights and thermoses. But the street was empty. Nobody came, not even the ones who promised they would stay until the end. At the police station, the urgency faded too. Desks that once held stacks of reports were now cleared for newer, louder cases. Officers who had once reassured her with steady voices now avoided eye contact when she walked in. She wasn't angry at them. She was angry at how easily they could move on. Angry at how quickly the world forgets a girl once the spotlight shifts. The final blow came when a sergeant, one she had known since he was a rookie, pulled her aside with a tired sigh. "Mrs. Carter, we've done all we can with what we have." She didn't argue. She didn't scream. She just stood there, numb, as if someone had lifted the ground from under her, because she understood what he really meant. We're giving up. You should too. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. She left the station, walked home alone, and stepped into a house that felt 10 times quieter than it had a month earlier. She placed Emily's favorite sketchbook on the kitchen table and whispered, "I'm not done. Not ever." The world may have stopped searching, but a mother never does. For most people in Maryland, 1979 felt like a fresh start. New businesses opening, new families moving into town, new elections, new roads. Life pressed forward as if nothing had been broken. But inside Miriam's house, time stood absolutely still. The world had the luxury of healing. She didn't. Neighbors who once brought casseroles stopped visiting. Conversations that once started with "any updates" turned into awkward silence. Some people even crossed the street when they saw her coming. Not out of cruelty, but because they didn't know what to say anymore. It was easier for them to forget than to face the reminder of what hadn't been found. The police department changed too. Younger officers joined, older ones retired. Each new voice on the phone treated the case like a file instead of a daughter. Miriam would introduce herself, and there would be a brief pause, the kind of pause that said, "Oh, Sham, she's still calling." Every year, she stood in front of the bulletin board downtown on the anniversary of her daughter's disappearance. At first, people stood beside her, then fewer, then none. Eventually, she was the only one staring at a fading poster, the ink running from years of sun and rain. But she never took it down. If the town wanted to forget, they could, but she wouldn't help them do it. What haunted her most wasn't the lack of answers. It was how quickly a community could adjust to someone's absence, how quickly they could fold life back into its normal rhythms while she remained stuck in the same unending night. She once told a friend, "I feel like the world put her down and walked away." And the worst part? She was right. By the early 80s, the missing posters had vanished from storefronts. New layers of tape covered the old bulletin boards, as if the town wanted to seal the past beneath fresh announcements. Most people stopped mentioning her name unless Miriam was within earshot. And even then their voices dropped, soft and uncomfortable, like they were talking about a ghost instead of a young girl who once laughed in the school courtyard. Kids who grew up after 1978 didn't even know the story. They walked the same sidewalks, caught the same buses, and played near the same woods without realizing a tragedy had once lived there. Teachers didn't bring it up. Parents didn't discuss it. The city didn't honor her. Silence replaced memory. Stores changed, streets changed. The courthouse got a new wing, yet the one thing that should have changed, the case, never did. Every detective assigned to it stayed only long enough to skim the file, shake their head at its age, and move on to more current work. Miriam saw it happening. She felt it happening. She knew the exact moment the town let go of her daughter. Not because of an announcement, but because of an absence. It was the first year not a single person knocked on her door on the anniversary. No flowers, no questions, not even a card. Just a normal day for everyone except her. That was when it truly sank in. She was carrying the weight alone now, and she would keep carrying it for as long as she lived. Miriam's home grew quieter every year. At first, the silence felt temporary, like a pause before good news. But as months stretched into seasons, and seasons hardened into years, that silence became the only constant in the house that used to pulse with her daughter's laughter. Her husband, once steady and certain, began to crumble in ways no one noticed until it was too late. He stopped shaving regularly. He stopped listening to the radio. He stopped fixing the porch gate he'd repaired a dozen times before. Grief didn't hit him loudly. It hollowed him out quietly, piece by piece. By 1988, he couldn't bring himself to walk past their daughter's room. He would stop at the doorway, stare at the posters still on the wall, and turn away as if the sight burned. When he died of a heart condition a few years later, the doctor called it stress-related. Miriam knew better. Something inside him had broken the night their daughter vanished, and it never healed. After the funeral, Miriam packed his clothes alone. She folded his shirts, smoothing the fabric the way she used to smooth her daughter's hair before school. She whispered, "You tried," even though he wasn't there to hear it. But the hardest changes were the small ones, the ones that didn't seem loud enough to count as heartbreak. The mailbox stopped filling. The phone stopped ringing. The friends stopped visiting. People avoid grief when they can. They avoid reminders. They avoid faces that make them feel helpless. And Miriam, without meaning to, became a reminder of everything the town wanted to bury. She still set a place for her daughter every Thanksgiving. She still bought her a birthday card each year. She still walked to the old bus stop every June and left a fresh lily near the rusted metal pole. Some mothers let go. She never did. Because letting go felt like losing her twice. As the years stretched on, Maryland started to change in ways that made the past feel farther than it really was. New stores opened. Old streets were repaved. Families moved in who had never heard her name. Little by little, the town rebuilt itself. Not because it healed, but because life forced it to keep going. But for Miriam, nothing moved. She watched her neighbors' lives expand while hers stayed rooted in the moment her daughter didn't come home. Christmas lights appeared on every porch except hers. Graduation photos filled other families' living rooms while her walls remained frozen in 1978. She wasn't jealous. She was grieving in a place that no longer understood why she couldn't move forward. Some avoided her at the grocery store, not out of cruelty, but discomfort. People don't know what to say to a mother who is still waiting after decades. Others changed the conversation whenever she brought up her daughter's case, acting like it was a topic too old to matter. But the truth was simple. It mattered to her, so it still mattered. Local reporters stopped calling. The police stopped updating her. The anniversary vigils shrank until they vanished completely. For the town, her daughter became an old headline. For Miriam, she was still the most important person in her world. She learned how to live inside the quiet, how to survive the hours when hope hurt more than memory. She started walking alone at sunrise, tracing the exact route her daughter should have taken home, whispering the same promise, "I'm still here." And every time she passed someone who didn't recognize her or didn't remember what happened, it cut a little deeper. Because forgetting Mama, that was the final loss. And she refused to let the world forget her child. Even though the community moved on, the truth is this. The detectives who first held the file never truly put it down. Detective Hal Vernon, the first lead on the case back in 1978, retired with a limp, a bad back, and one regret heavier than the rest. He carried her missing poster in his wallet until the day he died. His daughter later said he'd take it out during thunderstorms and stare at it in silence, as if the rain made the memory sharper. He never said it, but everyone close to him understood. Not finding her was the wound he never managed to close. Detective Carla Ruiz took over in the late 80s. She pushed harder, dug through every loose thread, and challenged every flawed assumption from the original search. But without new tools, she kept running into the same wall. A case that needed science the world hadn't invented yet. When she transferred divisions in the mid-90s, she wrote one final note in the file. "This case will break open one day. Don't let it rot." It did rot, though, not because anyone wanted it to, but because time happens. Staff changed, storage rooms were reorganized, priorities shifted, good intentions drowned under workload and politics. By the early 2000s, the case had passed through enough hands that no one even knew who officially owned it. It became an orphan file, living in a dusty box in the deep end of the records room, surviving only through the small acts of detectives who whispered her name when no one else did. But even if they couldn't solve it, they didn't forget her. Not truly. Every detective who touched the case left a piece of themselves inside that file. And if you opened it, if you sifted through the yellowing pages, you'd feel it instantly. This wasn't just a case. It was a promise. One that waited for the right moment, the right person, and the right science. A promise that had waited long enough. For decades, the evidence box sat in the basement of the Maryland State Police Archives. A box so old the tape had yellowed, the label had faded, and the cardboard had softened at the corners. Most officers walking past it never even noticed it. To them, it looked like clutter from a forgotten era. But inside that box was everything the truth had been trying to say for 40-plus years. Inside was the sweater scrap taken from the riverbank, a Polaroid of the search party gathered near the bridge, a cassette tape of early interviews, A torn page from Marianne's school notebook, and at the bottom, wrapped in a fragile evidence bag, was the small hair sample collected from her clothing. The one everyone back in 1978 had dismissed because the technology of the time couldn't read it. That hair was the key, but in 1978 it was a dead end. In 1988, it was useless. By 1980, it was an afterthought. By 2008, it was almost trash. Every year, a new officer would propose clearing out old, unsolved items to make space. And every year, some unknown archivist, no credit, no recognition, quietly slid the Cooper box to the back of another shelf, refusing to let it be discarded. No name was attached, but someone had protected it. Someone had kept the file alive, even when the city did everything it could to forget. Dust collected, tape peeled, paper curled, but the evidence stayed. And that tiny hair fragment, that little silent witness, waited with more patience than any human ever could. It waited for science. It waited for progress. It waited for someone who would actually listen. And in 20, after 46 years of silence, that someone finally arrived. By the early 2000s, Maryland had changed so much that Marianne's story felt like a rumor told by people who were no longer there to defend it. New businesses replaced old ones. Entire neighborhoods were remodeled. And the riverbank where her sweater scrap was found had been turned into a quiet walking trail where joggers passed without knowing what once happened there. People stopped speaking her name. Schools stopped mentioning her case. Reporters moved on to newer tragedies. But Miriam didn't. Every December, she held a small vigil at the foot of the old bridge, candles trembling in the winter wind, a framed photo of Marianne set on the railing, her daughter's smile lit by flickering light. Some years, 3 people came. Some years, none. But Miriam always stood there, coat wrapped tightly around her, whispering her daughter's name into a night that rarely whispered back. The town accepted her sadness the way people accept a landmark. They saw her from a distance, nodded politely, but no one approached. Because grief made them uncomfortable. Many residents didn't even know who she was. They only knew the story of the mother who kept showing up. Even when arthritis made walking painful, she kept making the trip. Even when friends passed away, she still lit the candles. Even when no officer returned her calls anymore, she kept dialing. Her son tried to convince her to stop, to find peace, but she refused gently. Peace isn't the same as forgetting, she told him. I can't do that. By 2020, Miriam was in her 70s, moving slower but holding the same determination. She didn't have promises. She didn't have updates. She didn't even have hope in the same way she once did. But she had loyalty. And loyalty kept her standing at that bridge long after everyone else walked away. Because while the world forgot Marianne, her mother refused to let time erase what mattered most. Her daughter deserved the truth, no matter how long it took. In early 2021, the Maryland Justice Renewal Initiative funded a statewide review of unresolved files. Most were simple audits, paperwork, digitization, indexing. But in the basement of the Montgomery County Records Facility, a clerk opened a box so old the tape cracked when she touched it. The label, faded but still legible. I'm didn't. Ellison Tanya, 1978. It was the first time in decades that anyone had spoken her name inside an official building. Inside the box were items untouched since the late 70s. Tanya's scarf, a fingernail scraping sample, a small sealed bag containing a hair fragment, photographs from the original scene, a report stamped insufficient evidence. The clerk paused, not because she understood the weight of the name, but because something about the untouched box felt wrong. She carried it to the supervisor, who forwarded it immediately to the new cold case unit. That single decision woke a case everyone else gave up on. Detective Lena Reyes, newly transferred to the cold case unit, was the kind of investigator who didn't shrug at old tragedies. When the Ellison box landed on her desk, she didn't assume it was another unsolvable relic from a time with fewer tools. She opened it slowly. The scarf still smelled faintly of the old evidence room. Dust and time. The hair fragment had never been properly tested. The fingernail scrapings contained biological traces long considered too degraded. Reyes whispered to herself, "Why did no one give you a chance?" She spent the rest of the day reading every report, every interview, every faded note from the first detectives who tried and failed to bring Tanya home. 40 years ago, the samples were considered too small, too damaged, or too contaminated to offer answers. But in 2021, Maryland's lab had a new weapon: forensic genome sequencing, a method strong enough to extract DNA from materials smaller than a grain of dust. Reyes requested immediate testing. She submitted the scar fiber sample, the hair fragment, the fingernail scrapings. The lab technicians warned her that results could take weeks, even months. She didn't care. She simply said, "Run everything. She deserves that." It was nearly midnight when the lab emailed her. A rush of adrenaline shot through Reyes when she saw the words, "Preliminary profile recovered. Partial male DNA." Not enough to name someone, but enough to search. She forwarded the data to the national database. No direct matches. But something large happened. Something unexpected. A partial familial connection appeared. Not a suspect, a bloodline. The name that surfaced was unfamiliar to most people in the justice system: Rowan. Reyes spent the next week tracing births, marriages, relocations, and public records associated with the Rowan family throughout Maryland and neighboring states. The web wasn't large. 3 generations, scattered addresses, but the line pointed to one branch that had lived near Tanya in 1978. 2 brothers, Henry Rowan and Thomas Rowan, ages 79 and 81 now. Both lifelong residents, both respected, both capable of living unnoticed for decades. Reyes built timelines for each brother: where they worked, where they lived, where they were on the night Tanya vanished. One detail struck her immediately. Henry Rowan once worked at a small machine shop less than 4 blocks from Tanya's bus stop. In the scar fibers from the evidence, the lab found a chemical signature used in machine lubrication from the 1970s, the same type Henry's shop used. Her breathing slowed, her chest tightened. This was no coincidence. This was direction. Reyes prepared a secure request to obtain a covert DNA sample from both brothers: a discarded cup, a tissue, anything legally obtainable. That was the next step. That was the only step. As she shut down her computer and gathered her notes, she stared at Tanya's photograph taped to her monitor. A girl who never made it home. A girl the city learned to forget. A girl whose mother kept a porch light burning for 45 long years. Reyes whispered, "Your story isn't silent anymore." The case didn't whisper. It demanded to be heard. Would you want science to reveal what your city tried to forget? Detective Marquez sat alone in the lab's review room, staring at the genealogy results as the report ran its final comparison. The system flashed a warning: partial family match detected, paternal lineage. One surname rose to the top: Brenner, a Maryland family with deep roots in the next county, known for running a carpentry shop in the late 70s. A family that lived close enough to the Ellison home to know Tanya's routine. Her breath caught. The Brenners had never been on the radar, not once in 45 years. The match narrowed further: 2 potential male contributors within the Brenner bloodline. Gerald Brenner, now 78, retired woodworker. Wayne Brenner, 74, formerly employed at a supply warehouse. Both elderly, both longtime Maryland residents, both with clean histories. But one detail made Marquez go still. Back in 1978, Gerald had volunteered during the search for Tanya. He had handed out coffee to officers. He had stood beside her mother at the first vigil. He had placed his hand on Miriam Ellison's shoulder and said, "We won't stop looking." It hit her like a punch, that strange pattern she'd seen in other solved cold cases. Someone who hides by appearing helpful. Someone who blends because he pretends to care. Using the DNA hit, Marquez went back through the old evidence logs and found something the 1978 team dismissed: a small wood shavings trace embedded in Tanya's torn sweater. The original detective wrote the words, "Likely environmental contamination, no further testing." But the cold case lab found a chemical residue in that shaving, a varnish formula discontinued in 1982, a formula used heavily at Brenner & Sons Carpentry. The file, the DNA, the varnish, all pointing in one direction: Gerald Brenner wasn't a name anymore. He was a location. To avoid tipping him off, Marquez coordinated with forensics to obtain a discarded sample from Gerald. Nothing invasive, nothing dramatic, just a used coffee cup from a senior community meeting. The sample went straight to the lab. The result came back in under 48 hours, stamped match, 99.98% likelihood. Marquez closed her eyes. Nearly 5 decades of silence had finally broken. Tanya's mother, Miriam Ellison, now in her 70s, sat across from Marquez in the small interview room. She had aged in the way grief forces people to, slowly, unevenly, with every year carved onto her face. Marquez gently placed the report in front of her. Miriam's hands trembled before she even touched it. "Is this real?" she whispered. Marquez nodded. Miriam read the name silently, her eyes filling with a pain that looked too heavy for her small frame to hold. "Gerald Brenner. He stood in my yard. He told me he hoped we'd find her." Her voice cracked. "He knew. All this time, he knew." Marquez said nothing. There was nothing to say. As Miriam tried to steady herself, she recalled something she had buried for years. In the early days of the search, Gerald had brought over a wooden toy he had crafted for the kids helping with the flyer distribution. He insisted Tanya would want the children to stay hopeful. Miriam accepted it at the time, too overwhelmed to think. But now her voice broke into a quiet, horrified whisper. "I remember his hands. They shook when he handed it to me. Not from age, from guilt." Detective Marquez replayed the old news footage from 1978, something she had skimmed over before. Search teams walking through woods, volunteers lining the streets, and there, barely noticeable, Gerald Brenner, younger than, standing directly behind Miriam during an interview. His eyes fixed not on the cameras, but on the missing poster of Tanya taped to the fence. A stare too long, too focused, too familiar to be innocent. Marquez felt a chill run through her. He wasn't watching the crowd. He was watching the memory of what he did. One sentence from the original case file echoed now with a different meaning. Offender likely knew the victim's routine. Back in 1978, the lead detective believed it referred to a neighbor or coworker. No one considered a volunteer. No one considered a man who pretended to search for Tanya so he could watch the family unravel. Marquez exhaled slowly. Gerald Brenner had hidden in plain sight by acting helpful. The disguise worked for decades. With the match confirmed, the cold case unit held an emergency briefing. Photos of Gerald, the day report, the fiber match, the genealogy tree. Marquez stood at the front, voice steady but heavy. For nearly 50 years, this family lived without answers. Today that changes. Every officer in the room went silent. This wasn't just a case, this was a restoration. While preparing the warrant, Marquez uncovered one last detail, a map of the 1978 search routes, every path volunteers covered, every home they checked, every field they walked through. Gerald Brenner had volunteered for several of those routes, but his assigned route stopped 300 feet before the wooded area where Tanya's shoes were found weeks later. He refused to search past that point. He said the terrain was too uneven. Now the truth hit with full weight. He didn't search there because he knew what he'd left behind. It was just after 6:10 a.m. when the unmarked cars turned onto Maple Hollow Road. The morning was quiet, the kind of quiet old neighborhoods fall into when no one expects anything to happen. Inside the Brenner home, Gerald sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, flipping through a newspaper like it was any other day. He didn't hear the soft steps on his walkway. He didn't see the officers fanning out around the porch. But when Detective Marquez knocked, something in him froze just for a second. A tiny hesitation that told her he already knew why they were there. "Gerald Brenner," she said, calm and steady. "We have a warrant for your arrest." He didn't shout. He didn't resist. He simply set the cup down and whispered, "After all these years." His wife stood in the hallway, confused, clutching her robe. "Gerald, what is this?" He didn't answer her. He just lowered his head as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. Years of pretending to be harmless ended in that single moment, the moment he realized time had stopped protecting him. While officers escorted him to the car, the forensic team moved into his workshop, a small building behind the house that neighbors always described as quiet and harmless. Nothing inside was harmless. Inside a latchy cabinet, they found a small metal tin wrapped in cloth. Inside it lay Tanya Ellison's gold pendant, the one her mother said she never took off. In another drawer, sealed inside an old envelope, were three Polaroid photos dated March 1978, all blurry, all of the same wooded area where Tanya's belongings were found decades earlier. On the back of one photo, written in faded ink, "Too close." That was enough. Maryland no longer had a suspect. It had a confirmed offender. By noon, the news broke. Elderly Maryland man arrested in 1978 cold case. Phones rang across town. People gathered on porches in shock. Neighbors who had lived beside Gerald for 40 years shook their heads, unable to understand how a man who fixed fences and shoveled snow for widows could carry something this cruel. A woman from 4 houses down told reporters, "He watched my kids when they were small. I trusted him with everything." Another said, "He prayed with us when Tanya vanished." And then, the one line repeated over and over, "He didn't look like someone who could do something like that." That line was why he got away with it for so long. That afternoon, Detective Marquez stepped up to the podium. Cameras flashed, reporters leaned forward, and for the first time in nearly 50 years, Tanya Ellison's name echoed through the state with clarity. "This arrest," Marquez began, her voice steady but emotional, "was made possible through new forensic tools, persistence, and a promise kept to a family who never stopped waiting." Behind her, a photo of Tanya, the same missing poster her mother once stapled to telephone poles, was projected onto the screen. A few officers wiped their eyes. A few parents in the crowd held their children tighter. Marquez continued, "We want every family to know, time may pass, but truth remains." And then she stepped back, visibly shaken, because she knew exactly how close this case had come to being lost forever. The arrest forced Maryland to confront a truth no one wanted to say out loud. A man who lived among them, helped them, laughed with them, talked with them, had walked free for decades while the Ellison family suffered alone. Parents who once let their kids play outside without worry now felt something tighten in their chest. Elders whispered about how they'd welcomed Gerald into church events. A retired officer admitted, "He gave us coffee during the search. We thanked him." People felt betrayed by their own assumptions, the belief that danger always looked dangerous. It never does. Within hours of the arrest, calls flooded the department, families who had daughters vanish in the late 70s and early 80s, people who remembered strange moments, odd encounters, uneasy feelings they never voiced. One elderly woman came to the station clutching an old photo of her niece and whispered, "He used to stand near the bus stop. We thought he was just waiting for a ride." Marquez wrote down every statement. The department opened additional files. Even if Gerald wasn't connected to every call, every family now saw an opening, a chance to finally be heard. As reporters asked questions and emotions ran high, one message echoed online. "He lived beside families for 50 years. Subscribe, because danger doesn't always look dangerous." For those who didn't subscribe, comments poured in. "Why wouldn't you want updates like this? If something like this happened near you, wouldn't you want to know?" Fear wasn't manufactured. It was earned. Detective Marquez drove straight to Miriam's house before the media could reach her. The porch light, the same light she had kept on for Tanya since 1978, still glowed in the early evening. When Marquez knocked, Miriam opened the door before she even finished raising her hand. "You found him," she whispered. It wasn't a question. Marquez nodded. Miriam pressed a trembling hand to her chest. "I knew God wouldn't let her stay silent forever." She went quiet then, sinking into the porch chair she had spent thousands of nights in, the chair facing the street, waiting for footsteps that never came. Not footsteps, but handcuffs. It was enough. As Gerald was booked, fingerprints taken, clothing cataloged, he stared straight ahead without emotion. But when they read him, the charge, murder of Tanya Ellison, he blinked hard, the first sign of fear he'd shown all day. Because for the first time in nearly 50 years, the truth had a voice stronger than his silence. Maryland had finally named the man who stole a young girl's future. And justice, slow as it was, arrived on time for the one family who kept the light burning. By the time Gerald Brenner was brought into the Richmond County Courthouse, the weight of 45 years sat on every shoulder in the room. The benches were full, retired officers, old neighbors, families who remembered Tanya's smile only from fading photographs. Some came seeking closure. Others came seeking answers. Gerald entered slowly, shackled, his age visible in every step. But nothing about his frailty softened the outrage in the air. This wasn't a courtroom waiting for a verdict. This was a community waiting for the truth that waited too long. When the judge asked for Gerald's plea, the courtroom fell silent. He didn't claim innocence. He didn't confess. He whispered three words that carried their own sting. "Offered plea, Your Honor." He accepted the evidence against him while pretending he didn't remember. People gasped. Someone shouted, "Coward!" Miriam Ellison closed her eyes, not surprised, only tired. She had waited half her life for honesty from the man who stole everything from her. He still refused to give it. When Detective Lena Marquez walked up to testify, she carried the evidence binder with both hands, the same binder she rebuilt piece by piece when the case reopened. Her voice didn't shake. "DNA confirmed it," she said. "The fibers matched, the timeline matched. The items found in his workshop belonged to Tanya Ellison." Then she paused and added the line that would define this trial. "Science remembers what people forget." The courtroom murmured. Everyone understood exactly who she meant by people. When Miriam took the stand, the air shifted. She didn't cry. Her tears had been spent decades earlier. She spoke with calm strength. Tanya was kind. She was gentle. She trusted people she shouldn't have. Her hands trembled slightly when she said the next part. "I kept a light on for her for 45 years. I kept it on because I knew someone would someday tell me the truth. And that truth is standing right there." She pointed at Gerald, his head lowered, but not in shame, only in surrender. Gerald's attorney attempted to argue memory loss, old age, confusion. But old age doesn't erase evidence. Time doesn't wash away DNA. The photographs recovered from his workshop were displayed on the projector. The pendant, the handwritten note, the area where Tanya's items were found. For every excuse the defense attempted, the evidence answered louder. When the judge delivered the final decision, the room went still. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Some wept, some nodded, some simply stared straight ahead, unsure how to feel after so many years of unanswered questions. But Miriam whispered, "Thank you." And for the first time in decades, her shoulders loosened just a little. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded Detective Marquez. One asked, "Do you think justice healed this community?" She looked toward the courthouse doors where Miriam stood alone under the afternoon sun. Then she answered carefully, "When justice finally speaks, it doesn't always heal. Sometimes it just reminds us of what we lost." Marilyn couldn't pretend anymore. People questioned how they missed the signs, how a trusted man blended into their lives while carrying a secret that gnawed at an entire generation. Parents held their children tighter. Neighbors looked at each other differently. Silence was no longer comfort. It was warning. As evening came, the courthouse emptied. The judge left. The reporters packed their equipment. The officers returned to the station. But Miriam stayed on the courthouse steps long after everyone else had gone, staring at the horizon. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was witnessing the end of a story she never wanted, and finally the beginning of peace. For decades, Marilyn carried Tanya's name quietly, tucked into old conversations, whispered at community gatherings, mentioned only when grief resurfaced. But 24 was different. For the first time, people spoke her name openly, not with fear, not with dread, but with respect. The silence that once protected the wrong person finally broke, and the city stepped forward to honor the young woman it failed to protect. Every June, a small group gathered near the path where Tanya was last seen in 1978. Some years, fewer than 5 people showed. Some years, no one came except Miriam. But in 2024, the memorial looked different. Candles lined the walkway, handwritten notes filled the fence, and families from all over the county arrived carrying flowers. Teenagers who never met Tanya came because their parents told them her story. Survivors of other tragedies came because they understood loss. For once, grief wasn't quiet. it was shared, and that sharing felt like healing. Months after the trial ended, community leaders met with Miriam to discuss creating something lasting, something that reflected who Tanya was, not just what happened to her. Tanya had dreamed of studying nursing, of helping people, of leaving a mark on the world through kindness. So the Tanya Ellison Nursing Scholarship was created. Funded entirely through local donations, it supported young women entering healthcare, young women who, like Tanya, wanted to make others feel safe. Dozens applied. Many wrote letters about how Tanya's story changed the way they looked at their own lives. Miriam read every application with trembling hands, grateful that her daughter's compassion lived on in others. Detective Lena Marquez never sought praise. She didn't reopen Tanya's case for recognition. She reopened it because Tanya deserved someone who wouldn't give up. But Marilyn felt differently. At a statewide ceremony, Marquez was honored for her persistence, her refusal to settle for lost files or forgotten evidence, and for believing in a girl she never met. When she accepted the award, she didn't speak about herself. She spoke about Tanya. "Justice isn't loud," she said softly. "It's steady. It waits for the person willing to carry it the last mile." The room stood in silence. Some called it the most powerful moment of the entire event. Marilyn had avoided the truth for years. People preferred to remember the neighborhood as peaceful, to pretend the danger had come from elsewhere. But after Gerald's conviction, denial no longer felt comfortable. Church groups held forums. Schools taught safety differently. Neighborhood associations encouraged residents to look out for one another, not with suspicion, but with responsibility. For many, facing the truth was painful, but it was the first honest step toward healing a wound that had been ignored too long. Old photographs of Tanya were restored and displayed at the local library, smiling, joyful, full of life. Children pointed at them, asking their parents, "Who was she?" Parents answered with dignity, "She was someone our town should have protected." For the first time, the story wasn't being told as a warning. It was being told as a promise. Tamamis, a reminder that kindness still needed defending, that innocence still deserved a voice, and that communities could change if they chose to. On the anniversary of Tanya's disappearance, Miriam returned home to something she didn't expect. Dozens of neighbors standing on her street, each holding a small candle. They gathered in front of the house where Tanya once lived, where the porch light had burned every night for 46 years. This time, Miriam didn't turn it on. She didn't need to. The entire street glowed, a silent tribute, a shared vow. Later that night, Miriam sat alone on her porch, for the first time in her life. She didn't check the driveway. She didn't listen for footsteps. She didn't wait for a phone call that would never come. Instead, she closed her eyes and breathed, deeply, slowly, peacefully. Justice hadn't brought back her daughter, but it had brought an ending she could finally live with. And after 46 years, she let the porch light go dark. In a city of thousands, one young woman refused to be forgotten. And because she held on, so did justice.